Hello everyone. I'm Brock Allen, Director of the SDSU Center for Teaching and Learning. You can call me Brock. Today we'll examine current perspectives in psychology, a topic that was briefly covered in Chapter 1 of our Psych 101 textbook. Please feel free to ask questions throughout this session so we can address your concerns and so we can maintain an open dialogue while we explore this topic. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to respond anonymously to one of those survey questions that psychologists like to ask. Please take a few seconds to read these statements and to click on the statement that is most similar to your own views. We're going for first reactions here, so you don't need to give this much thought right now. Just click your answer, please. Okay, your responses are coming in. Looking at the chart in the lower right, it appears that students in this session hold pretty different views on psychology. Or maybe not. Perhaps you felt a little uncomfortable in being forced to select one perspective to represent your views. These two perspectives each represent major schools of psychological thought. The textbook in Chapter 1 characterizes these as current perspectives in psychology because they represent powerful ideas for explaining what makes us feel, think, and act the way we do. Each perspective originated in different historical movements within psychology that used different methods to investigate psychological phenomena. Understanding a little bit about these perspectives can help you to make better sense of what you will learn in Psych 101 and perhaps how we might apply what we learn to different situations in everyday life. Any thoughts about this? So Jose writes, what are the other perspectives in the text? What about the other perspectives in the text? Humanistic, cognitive, evolutionary, biological. Jose, we're going to focus on two perspectives for this session. But we'll try to tie them in to a couple of others that are outlined in Chapter 1. Please be sure to study the other perspectives in the last section of that chapter. Chloe writes, so you're saying no one perspective is actually correct, that it's all relative? Well, one way to think about the term perspective is that it's a kind of a metaphor that visually, when we adopt a perspective or a point of view, we position ourselves to see certain aspects of something, like sides of a mountain or a building. The perspectives metaphor reminds us that there could be other perspectives that would allow us to see other aspects. So trying to decide too early on a single best perspective can prevent us from exploring the whole field of psychology. Lindsay asks, do you favor any of these perspectives in particular? Well, Lindsay, my professional specialty is the psychology of learning and particularly technology-based learning. My undergraduate work was in biology and evolution, so I'm oriented towards the biological perspective and the evolutionary perspective, but my PhD program placed a strong emphasis on the cognitive perspective, so I'm sort of a blend. By the way, psychology runs in my family. My daughter Sophia is studying for a PhD in school psychology, and her grandfather, David Allen, was a psychiatrist and a Freudian psychoanalyst. All right, back to our two perspectives. Here's what you should be able to do at the end of this session. Most Most of us have heard of Sigmund Freud, who is usually considered the founder of the psychodynamic perspective. He began his career as a physician specializing in disorders of the nervous system, but he became interested in patients whose symptoms didn't yield to ordinary explanations of disease. So Freud developed a method of treatment in which his patients would talk about themselves, and he and the patient would then collaborate in analyzing the patient's thoughts and what these thoughts might reveal about the psychodynamics of the patient's unconscious mental life. This essentially was the beginning of psychoanalysis. Let me ask you to read Freud's main propositions. So the term psychodynamics suggests that our interior mental lives balance various forces or influences that are constantly changing and adjusting to each other. Freud thought that all human beings encounter challenges in their early childhood that shape unconscious desires later in life. For example, early on, when infants are very close to their mothers during breastfeeding, the presence of the father may seem an unwelcome intrusion, even an interruption of the intimacy with the mother and the satisfactions of that stream of very warm milk. As children develop, they usually learn to manage these feelings about the father. But in dysfunctional families, where the father is insecure and envious of the child's special relationship with the mother, the issues sometimes remain unresolved at an unconscious level that can influence the child's sexual attitudes later in life, as well as conflicts with father-like authority figures. We might not remember these incidents consciously, Freud argued, but they can profoundly affect the way we view ourselves and others. Freud is famous for his psychodynamic model of the human psyche, in which three aspects are constantly interacting. The id, representing drives associated with basic biological needs such as hunger and thirst and sexual appetites. In contrast, the superego kind of represents a stand-in for parental authority. So when an infant is attracted to its mother's breasts and desperately wants to suck milk, the id is largely in control. But what if Bart, the baby, gets just a little too frisky and nippy? Mom might indicate some displeasure and even brusquely remove him from her nipple. This is the kind of experience that gradually shapes the superego, the aspect of the psyche that is concerned with the demands of the family and, more generally, society. Demands that the basic instincts of the id be suppressed or controlled for the good of others, for the good of the social order. Further development of the superego might occur when, as a 3-year-old, young Bart raids the cookie jar, when Mom sternly tells him to put the loot back. She's exerting parental authority. And when Bart internalizes her expectations, he's building up his superego. Here's the key. In Freud's theory of the unconscious, the third aspect of the ego works as a kind of mediator that balances or resolves conflicts between the id and the superego. Although we're not always, in fact, we're usually unaware of its balancing acts. This usage of the term ego is different than our popular use of the term egotistical to mean self-centered, as in, oh my God, she has an ego as big as a house. Tim writes, so the id is the bad guy and the superego is the good guy, like the devil and angel, sinner and saint. Tim, I think you're right in the sense that the id and the superego are often in conflict. But imagine if the superego was completely in command all the time, was successful in mostly suppressing the id. What kind of person would result? Would they be good? Anyone? Jennifer writes, well, they might be overly obedient to authority, want to follow the rules. They might be too shy to get their share of food or too repressed to have sex and kids. Amanda says, a person with a very strong superego might be kind of saintly, or like Buddha, foregoing the pleasures of the material world. Great comments. And you could both be right, but we might want to ask whether a person who chooses to renounce materialism is making a conscious choice, or whether certain forms of self-denial involving food and material rewards might result from inner compulsions or psychological imbalances. Freud's ideas of unconscious forces and wishes have influenced popular culture enormously. Before Freud, for example, people gave little thought to dreams as an expression of unconscious fears and desires, or the idea that symbols might have particular meanings for the unconscious. Psychoanalysis, Freud's original talk therapy, is not as fashionable as it once was, and it appears to work better with patients who are psychologically minded and willing to learn to talk freely with a therapist. My father describes the frustration and disappointment many psychiatrists felt in working with severely depressed or psychotic patients in the 1940s and 50s, before the advent of modern psychiatric medications. Doctors sometimes had to use very primitive methods like putting patients in straitjackets or wrapping them in wet sheets to calm them down. Sometimes they used methods that seem cruel today, such as electroshock therapy. But the underlying problem was that medicine in those days had a very limited understanding of brain biochemistry. Casey writes, I have a family member who's on an antidepressant called Prozac. He doesn't see a psychiatrist, just a regular doctor, and all the doctor does is give him the prescription, no talk therapy. Casey, psychodynamic methods for treating mental illness are limited, and they're expensive because they require trained therapists working one-on-one or with small groups, so they're not often covered by medical insurance. On the other hand, there's great concern among some psychiatrists that drugs like Prozac mostly treat symptoms and won't help the underlying causes of these symptoms. Okay, let's shift to the other perspective we're exploring today, the behaviors perspective. What comes to mind when you hear the word behaviorism? Jessica writes, ringing bells, salivating dogs. Danielle, positive and negative reinforcement. My brother's teacher uses a point system to reward kids for good behavior. Alex writes, they use behaviors methods at SeaWorld to train killer whales and dolphins. Like after every trick, they give them fish or pat them. Right. So, as some of you suggest, behaviorists have conducted much of their research with animals, but their principles of behaviorism have been applied to human problems. Overall, those who endorse the behaviorist perspective are concerned with this central question: in what ways do the environmental factors or stimuli influence particular responses? Now, as we start comparing the two perspectives that we're reviewing today, the behaviorist and the psychodynamic perspective, it's useful to remember that psychology was considered a branch of philosophy until the early 1900s. Even scientifically trained pioneers like Freud often wrote in a style that sounded more like philosophy or history than science, with book titles like Moses and Monotheism, Civilization and Its Discontents, and Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So behaviorist critics such as John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner criticize psychodynamic theories like Freud's relentlessly, asking, where is the evidence? Where are the observations to support the assertions that entities such as the id, ego, and superego actually exist? Behaviorists argued that psychology would never mature into a real science, if you will, until it abandoned its tendency towards undisciplined speculation and assertions that couldn't be supported by hard laboratory evidence. They argued that psychologists should focus on the observable, and they argued that what can be observed are the behaviors of organisms and people, not the internal processes of their brains or minds. Now, today, of course, we have brain scanning machines that actually allow us to see which parts of the brain are working when people are solving a puzzle or playing a piano. But in the heyday of the behaviorist perspective, there was no practical way to see what the brain was doing. Thus, the behaviorists proposed that the brain should be treated as a kind of black box. They said it was unscientific and even delusional to suggest or guess at the brain's inner workings, because there was no way to verify these ideas. The more radical behaviorists condemned as unscientific all theorizing about how the brain perceives, how it remembers and reasons, how it makes sense of language and symbols. Needless to say, these radical behaviorists didn't appreciate concepts like the id, the ego, and the superego. They insisted psychology should focus on the inputs to the black box, the stimuli, and the outputs, that is, the environment and the behavior. Let's consider Skinner's famous ABC model, antecedents, behavior, and consequences. The subject, an animal or person, experiences some situation or stimulus. This is the antecedent, which basically just means before. The subject behaves in a certain way in response and experiences the consequences of that behavior. So let's apply this to the suckling infant example we talked about earlier. The hungry infant sees the breast, the stimulus. Instinctively, it roots and finds the nipple and begins sucking. This is the behavior. The consequence is the flow of warm, satisfying milk. What began as an instinctive behavior of rooting and sucking is strongly reinforced by breast milk. In other words, the infant is even more likely to root and suck the next time it's hungry and sees a breast. Once a sequence like this is learned, it's called a stimulus-response sequence, because the stimulus elicits the response. But suppose the mother isn't lactating due to a painful breast infection. The consequence is different. No milk. The mother pushes the infant away. The instinctive behavior is not reinforced. and after many such rejections, the infant might be less likely to root and suck. Was the infant who was denied milk conflicted? Would the mother-child bond be damaged? The radical behaviorists would have argued that there's no need to speculate about internal mental mechanisms that can't be verified. Skinner's work led to the development of the theory of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning describes our behavior as a response to certain specific consequences in the past. So if we get a speeding ticket, it's more likely that we'll drive within the speed limit when we drive on the same road in the future. But there are also positive examples related to this principle. If our significant others give us a kiss, when we give them flowers, we might be more likely to give them flowers when we want to kiss again. On a more serious note, positive reinforcement is used for educating children, for modifying patients with certain psychological disorders. Skinner argued that the gambling industry makes extensive use of operant conditioning principles, and he liked to point out that the similarities between animals pulling levers in his famous Skinner boxes and the repetitive lever pulling of slot machine addicts. Skinner's work with operant conditioning focused on vertebrates, such as rats and pigeons. But one of the striking discoveries in recent years is that even much simpler animals can respond to operant conditioning, including, surprise, fruit flies. Using operant conditioning, researchers have trained fruit flies to follow simple mazes to find food, to avoid nasty electric shocks. So stimulus response reinforcement works with tiny insects too. But the lives of fruit flies are much richer than that. Let's call this sex, flies, and videotapes. Detailed video analysis of fruit flies in laboratory studies reveals that they have fairly complex social lives in which males compete for each other, compete for females, and engage in tiny boxing matches using their front legs. After duking it out, they also engage in courtship rituals with the opposite sex. But sometimes they're rejected by females. Lissa asks, is this for real? Are you joking? Lissa, no. This is based on real science cited in a recent issue of the journal Science. But there is a joke. I'm almost there. It turns out that these activities involve a lot of learning that can be measured in increased connections between flies' nerve cells. Also, flies that engage in this kind of partying need more sleep and take more tiny fly naps than flies that are kept in isolation. That's real too. So, does this mean that the rejected fly suitors suffer from the kind of psychodynamic issues that Freud so famously treated with his talk therapy? Do they have tiny egos, tiny ids, and superegos? Let's leave those questions for another day. To get serious just one more time, keep in mind that each of the two perspectives that we've reviewed today rests on different assumptions, and each leads to different ways of looking for answers to